Hitler had a plan to starve Britain into submission, but he never counted on American engineers inventing a bear trap to hunt his hunters. In 1942, American ships were burning within sight of our own shores. It was a failure, until a few clever minds built the secret weapons that would end the U-boat war for good. Many remember the B-17s and the tanks of WWII, but the most important battle was fought in the dark, icy Atlantic, and it was won by a piece of technology that worked just like a bear trap. Hitler had a plan to starve an entire island nation into submission. He wasn't going to use V-2 rockets or bombers or a grand army. He was going to use a handful of steel tubes filled with men lurking in the dark. He was going to use the U-boat. And in 1941, his plan was working. The North Atlantic was a graveyard. Winston Churchill, a man who stared down the Blitz without flinching, later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. And he had every reason to be terrified. Britain, standing alone against the Nazi war machine, was an island. It needed everything from the outside world. It needed food to feed its people, oil to fuel its Spitfires, and steel to build its tanks. All of it, every last bullet and every barrel of fuel, had to cross that vast, cold ocean. But standing in the way was Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of Hitler's U-boat fleet. Dönitz was a brilliant, ruthless tactician. He didn't believe in honorable duels between battleships. He believed in one thing: Tonnage Creek, the Tonnage War. The concept was simple, and it was brutal. It didn't matter what the ships were carrying. It didn't matter if they were tankers or freighters or passenger liners. All that mattered was their weight, their tonnage. Dönitz calculated that if his U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve. Its factories would grind to a halt. Its armies would have no fuel. The island would suffocate and be forced to surrender. To do this, he didn't send his U-boats out alone. He organized them into what the British would come to call wolf packs. A U-boat on its own was a threat, but a wolf pack was a nightmare. The strategy was simple. One U-boat, scouting the vast shipping lanes, would spot a convoy, but it wouldn't attack. Not yet. It would surface, staying just over the horizon, and begin transmitting a radio signal back to headquarters. Dönitz, from his command center in France, would receive the signal and begin vectoring every other U-boat in the area toward that one spot. For a day, sometimes two, the convoy would sail on, completely unaware that a pack of predators was gathering around it, just out of sight. The U-boat crews could see the smoke from the freighter's funnels. They would wait. Then, when the pack was assembled, Dönitz would give the order, and under the cover of darkness, the U-boats would strike. They would slip inside the protective screen of destroyers, surfacing in the middle of the convoy, firing torpedoes in every direction. It was chaos. Ships exploded. Men were thrown into the freezing water. The escort ships, the destroyers, would race around trying to find the attackers, dropping depth charges. But the U-boats were often already gone, diving deep and slipping away into the black. This was the happy time, as the U-boat crews called it. From 1940 to 1941, they sank ships with horrifying impunity. They were the masters of the Atlantic, and Hitler, watching Britain slowly choke, was convinced his underestimation of naval power was a thing of the past. He believed his U-boats were invincible. This arrogance, this absolute certainty in their own technological and tactical superiority, was a fatal flaw. It ran deep in the Nazi high command, and it would, in the end, be their undoing. Because they weren't just underestimating the British. They were underestimating the nation that was about to be dragged into the fight. The U-boat itself was a marvel of engineering for its time. The workhorse was the Type 7. It was a rugged, dependable, and deadly machine. It could travel for thousands of miles, stay at sea for weeks, and carried a payload of torpedoes that could cripple a battleship. The men who crewed them were an elite force, the best of the German Kriegsmarine. They were young, highly trained, and utterly loyal to their admiral, Dönitz. They called themselves the Grey Wolves, and they hunted with a terrifying efficiency. We often think of submarine warfare as this silent, hidden game. But for the sailors on those merchant ships, it was anything but. A torpedo strike was a cataclysm of fire and twisted metal. For those who survived the initial blast, their fate was often a slow death in the icy water, with no rescue in sight. The Atlantic became a 1,000-mile-long cemetery, marked only by oil slicks and floating debris. The British were desperate. They organized convoys, grouping their merchant ships together and surrounding them with a thin screen of warships, mostly destroyers and corvettes. It was a sound idea, but they just didn't have enough ships. The escorts were stretched impossibly thin, trying to guard dozens of slow, lumbering freighters spread out over miles of ocean. The wolf packs just picked them off, one by one. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust a sleeping America into the war. And just 4 days later, in a move of pure, unadulterated hubris, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. He viewed America as a mongrel society, a nation of immigrants, decadent and soft, incapable of mounting a serious fight. He believed our industrial power was a bluff, and our soldiers were weak. He gave Karl Dönitz the one thing he'd been begging for: the green light to attack American ships anywhere, anytime. Dönitz didn't hesitate. He launched Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. And for the United States, it was the beginning of our own second happy time. And it was, for a time, one of the greatest military humiliations in our history.
This is a chapter of the war that many of us, frankly, have forgotten. We remember the heroes of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, but in the first 6 months of 1942, the war was not over there. It was right here, on our own doorstep. Dönitz sent his best U-boat aces, men like Reinhard Hartigan, to the American coast, and they found a target-rich environment unlike anything they had ever dreamed of. The U.S. East Coast was, to put it plainly, completely unprepared. The coastal cities were lit up like Christmas trees. There were no blackouts. The glow of New York City, of Atlantic City, of Miami was visible for miles out to sea. And against this glowing backdrop, the silhouettes of American tankers and freighters sailing alone and without escort were perfect targets. Hartigan and his fellow commanders couldn't believe their luck. They called it the Great American Turkey Shoot. They would sit on the surface in broad daylight, line up their shots, and sink ship after ship. Tankers full of oil bound for Britain erupted in flames just off the coast of North Carolina, at Cape Hatteras. Civilians on the beaches of Virginia and Florida woke up to find their shores black with oil and littered with the wreckage of sunken ships. They watched, helpless, as pillars of smoke rose from the horizon, knowing that men were dying just a few miles away. In those first few months, the U-boats sank hundreds of American ships. They laid mines in the shipping channels of the Chesapeake Bay. They torpedoed vessels in the mouth of the Mississippi River. The U-boat crews would surface, get on their deck guns, and shell ships that had run aground. They were so bold, some commanders later claimed that they could see the lights of the Ferris wheel at Coney Island from their periscopes. The U.S. Navy was in chaos. Our best ships were in the Pacific, reeling from Pearl Harbor. The ships we had in the Atlantic were few, and they were obsolete. We had almost no anti-submarine vessels, and the ones we did have were World War I-era destroyers. We didn't have the training, we didn't have the doctrine, and we certainly didn't have the weapons. The public was terrified, the military was embarrassed, and Hitler was delighted. His underestimations seemed to be paying off. The problem was simple, but it seemed impossible to solve. How do you hunt a predator that you cannot see? The ocean is vast, dark, and deep. A submarine is a tiny speck in that immensity. It was like trying to find a single, specific needle in 1,000 haystacks, all of which are on fire and sinking. We were not just losing the war. We were being humiliated off our own shores. We needed a new way of thinking. We needed a new kind of weapon. We didn't just need a bigger club. We needed a trap. We needed a way to hunt the hunter, to turn the U-boat's greatest strength, its invisibility, into its greatest weakness. And the seeds of that trap were already being sown, not in the shipyards, but in the laboratories. The British, who had been fighting this menace for 2 years longer than we had, gave us the first piece of the puzzle. It was a technology they called ASDIC. Today we call it sonar. It was a marvelous invention for its time. It worked by sending a pulse of sound, a ping, out from a transmitter under the hull of a destroyer. This sound wave would travel through the water, hit a solid object, like a submarine, and bounce back as an echo. The operator, wearing a headset, would hear that echo. Ping, ping, and by timing the return and its direction, he could get a rough idea of the submarine's range and bearing. For the first time, the hunter had ears. This was a massive leap forward. The U-boat was no longer completely invisible. A destroyer could now, in theory, track a submerged U-boat. But theory and practice are two very different things, especially in the middle of a storm-tossed Atlantic. Sonar was not a magic bullet. It was a crude and temperamental tool. The operators had to be highly skilled to tell the difference between a U-boat and a whale, or a school of fish, or even a layer of colder water which could all send back a false echo. And the U-boat commanders were not stupid. They learned to listen for the ping. The moment they heard it, they knew they were being hunted. They would dive deep, sometimes to crushing depths, and make sharp, erratic turns, trying to lose the destroyer in the underwater clutter. But sonar had one enormous, fatal flaw. The transmitter was fixed to the bottom of the ship and it pointed forward and to the sides. It could not point straight down. This created a terrifying blind spot. As a destroyer got closer to a U-boat, its sonar beam would pass over the top of the submarine. In the final critical moments of the attack, the last few hundred yards, the sonar operator would suddenly lose the echo. The ping would just go out into the void and nothing would come back. The destroyer was suddenly blind at the exact moment it needed its eyes the most. The U-boat commander knew this. He knew that the moment the pinging stopped, the destroyer was directly overhead. And he also knew that it would take several seconds for the destroyer's weapon, the depth charge, to actually sink down to his level. In those precious seconds, he would order a hard turn and a crash dive, trying to get out of the way before the bombs arrived. This was the deadly game of cat and mouse. The destroyer would race over the last known position, roll its depth charges off the stern, and everyone on board would hold their breath, waiting for the massive underwater explosions. More often than not, they were met with silence. The U-boat had slipped away. The hunter was blind at the moment of the kill. And Hitler and Dönitz, fully aware of this weakness, remained confident. This was only one problem. The other was the sheer size of the ocean. Sonar was only useful if you were already close to a U-boat. But in the middle of the Atlantic, there was a massive, 1,000-mile-wide gap where no land-based aircraft could reach. The U-boats called it the Black Pit. In this gap, they could surface with impunity, recharge their batteries, and hunt convoys without fear of being spotted from the air. Allied aircraft like the British Short Sunderland and the American PBY Catalina were doing heroic work, but they just didn't have the legs to cover the mid-Atlantic. The U-boats reigned supreme in that dark, empty stretch of water. We needed to put eyes in the sky, right in the middle of the ocean. The first solution was desperate. It was the catapult aircraft merchantmen, or CAM ship. These were regular cargo ships that had a giant steam catapult bolted to their bow with a single Hawker Hurricane fighter plane sitting on it. If a German Focke-Wulf Condor, the long-range scout plane that hunted for convoys, was spotted, the British pilot would climb into his cockpit and be launched into the air. It was, quite literally, a one-way mission.
There was no way to land the plane back on the ship. After the pilot hopefully shot down the German plane, he had two choices: try to ditch his plane in the ocean near the convoy and hope to be picked up, or if he was low on fuel, simply bail out and parachute into the freezing water. Many pilots were lost. It was an act of incredible, almost suicidal bravery, but it showed how desperate the Allies were to control the air. This brings us to a part of the story that every American, especially those who remember the power of our industry, should be proud of. We needed a real solution. We needed to build airfields that could move. We needed aircraft carriers. Not the massive fleet carriers that were fighting in the Pacific, but small, cheap, and numerous carriers that could be built fast. The answer came from a man named Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder. He was a construction magnate, the man who built the Hoover Dam. He looked at shipbuilding not as an art, but as a manufacturing problem. He applied the principles of the assembly line to the shipyard. His Liberty ships, the simple cargo vessels, were being built at a staggering rate. At one point, his yards were launching a new ship every single day. So the U.S. Navy went to him and asked if he could build small aircraft carriers on those same merchant ship hulls. They were called escort carriers, or CVEs. The crews called them jeep carriers. They were slow, they were unarmored, they were ugly, they were everything a thoroughbred warship was not. And they were the ships that won the Battle of the Atlantic. Kaiser's shipyards began to churn them out. Suddenly, these convoys didn't just have a few destroyers for protection. They had their own private air force sailing right alongside them. Long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator, which had finally been diverted to naval patrols, could now fly from Newfoundland or Iceland, refuel at a jeep carrier, and cover the Black Pit from above. The U-boat's favorite hunting ground was gone. If a U-boat surfaced to charge its batteries, a plane would be on it in minutes, dropping bombs or rockets. The hunter had become the hunted. This combination of long-range air power and floating airfields was a body blow to Dönitz's fleet, but it still wasn't the knockout punch. Because even if a plane spotted a U-boat and forced it to dive, the plane couldn't kill it. It could drop a depth charge, but it was rarely accurate. The plane's job was to wound the sub, or more often to simply keep it down, to pin it, and call in the destroyers. The real killing was still left to the ships, and they still had that same infuriating problem, the sonar blind spot. So let's review the situation. We have ships that can hear the U-boat, we have planes that can see the U-boat, but we still can't reliably kill the U-boat. The depth charge, the main weapon, was a tool of saturation, not precision. A destroyer would have to drop dozens of these things, costing a fortune just to have a small chance of damaging the submarine's hull. The charges were set to explode at a certain depth. If you got the depth wrong, the explosion was useless. The U-boat crews were tough. They could withstand a nearby blast. It would shake the boat violently, shatter light bulbs, and terrify the crew, but it often wouldn't breach the pressure hull. The U-boat would leak, but it would survive, limp away, and return to base to be repaired. The destroyer captains were frustrated. They could track their prey for hours, get right on top of it, and then in the final seconds, the sub would vanish from their screens, and they were left guessing. They were dropping bombs on a ghost. Hitler and Dönitz, while concerned about the new air cover, still believed in the fundamental superiority of their U-boats. They believed that as long as their crews were skilled enough, they could always exploit that final, blind moment and escape. This was Hitler's great underestimation. He underestimated the anger of a nation that had been attacked. He underestimated the industrial power of a nation that could build ships faster than he could sink them. But most of all, he underestimated the sheer, dogged ingenuity of American and British engineers who were, at that very moment, working on the real Beartrap. This new weapon wasn't a bomb. It wasn't designed to destroy with a massive concussive blast. It was a killer. A precision weapon. It was developed by the British, but it was quickly adopted and mass-produced by the United States, and it was called, appropriately, the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was a forward-throwing mortar. It looked like a metal box with 20 dozen spigots sticking out of it, mounted on the bow of the destroyer. Instead of rolling charges off the stern, the destroyer would now attack from the front. And this simple change revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. Here is why it was the perfect bear trap. Remember the destroyer's blind spot? It was caused by the ship having to sail over the submarine to drop its depth charges. Because the Hedgehog fired its projectiles forward, hundreds of yards in front of the ship, the destroyer never had to sail over the submarine.
The sonar operator could keep his ping on the target, guiding the ship right in. He would call out the bearings. Target bearing 015, range 400 yards, 350 yards. The destroyer captain would keep his ship aimed directly at the echo. The U-boat commander, hearing the steady ping, ping, ping getting closer, would be confused. This wasn't the right tactic. The destroyer was supposed to be passing overhead by now. It was supposed to be blind. And then, just as the U-boat commander was trying to figure out what was happening, the sonar operator would yell, "Fire!" The destroyer's deck would erupt with a thwump, thwump, thwump as the Hedgehog launcher fired its 24 small teardrop-shaped mortars into the air. They would arc up and then splash into the water in a wide circular pattern, right on top of the U-boat's position. But here's the second and most terrifying part of the Hedgehog's design. They didn't explode on a timer. They only exploded on contact. This was the bear trap snapping shut. For the U-boat crew, the experience was beyond terrifying. With depth charges, they got a warning. The pinging would stop. They knew the charges were in the water. They had seconds to brace for impact. With the Hedgehog, there was no warning. Just the faint sound of 24 small objects splashing into the water above them. And then one of two things happened. Either there was silence, which meant the destroyer had missed and would be coming around for another pass, or there was a sudden, violent, single explosion. And if you heard that one explosion, you were already dead, because it meant one of the charges had hit the hull. And a contact-fused charge, even a small one, was infinitely more deadly than a massive nearby depth charge. The explosion would punch a hole straight through the pressure hull. The sea would rush in with unimaginable force, and the U-boat with all its crew would be gone in seconds. There was no escape. There was no time to even react. It was a perfect, clinical kill. The Hedgehog was the weapon that U-boat crews feared most. It robbed them of their invisibility and their one last chance to escape. When Karl Dönitz began to read the after-action reports, or rather the lack of reports, he was horrified. His best U-boat aces, men who had survived for years, were suddenly vanishing. Ships were being lost on their very first patrols. The bear trap was working. In his own diary, Dönitz wrote that the Allies had found a way to rob the U-boat of its one great advantage. The tide was turning. But Dönitz and his engineers were not idle. They knew they had to fight back. If the Allies had a new weapon, Germany would have a new counterweapon. If the Allies were hunting his U-boats would hunt the hunters. In late 1943, they introduced a new and truly terrifying piece of technology, the GNAT, the German Naval Acoustic Torpedo. This was a fire-and-forget weapon. It was a torpedo with a primitive brain. It had acoustic sensors in its nose that were designed to listen for a very specific sound, the high-pitched cavitation of a destroyer's propellers. A U-boat commander no longer had to aim his torpedoes. He could just point his submarine in the general direction of the convoy escorts, fire the GNAT, and dive deep. The torpedo would swim out, listening. The moment it heard a destroyer's propellers, it would turn and home in on the sound, exploding directly beneath the ship's engine room. For the first few weeks, the GNAT was a devastating success. Allied destroyers and corvettes, the very ships designed to protect the convoys, were suddenly exploding. They were being hunted by the weapons they were supposed to be avoiding. The hunter had become the hunted yet again. But here, once more, Hitler underestimated the speed and ingenuity of American engineering. The GNAT was a brilliant piece of technology, but it had a simple, exploitable flaw. It homed in on the loudest sound. So the US Navy and the British Royal Navy developed a countermeasure that was brilliantly simple, rugged, and cheap. It was codenamed Foxer. Foxer was essentially just a noisemaker. It was a set of metal bars or pipes towed on a long cable hundreds of feet behind the destroyer. As it was dragged through the water, it created a massive amount of turbulence and noise, a sound that was, crucially, much louder than the ship's own propellers. Now when a U-boat fired a GNAT torpedo, the acoustic sensors would hear two sounds, the ship's propellers and the much, much louder Foxer. The torpedo's simple brain would lock onto the loudest signal. It would race past the destroyer, chase the Foxer, and explode harmlessly at the end of the cable. It was a simple, ingenious solution that completely neutralized Germany's new wonder weapon in a matter of weeks. This back and forth, this war of measure and countermeasure, was happening at a furious pace. But we still haven't discussed the single most important bear trap of them all. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a ship. It was a secret.
The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a war of steel and explosives. It was a war of information. Admiral Dönitz commanded his vast fleet of U-boats using coded radio messages. He would tell his wolf packs where to gather, when to strike, and where the convoys were. The entire system depended on this communication. And to protect it, the Germans used the most sophisticated coding machine in the world, the Enigma. The Enigma machine looked like a typewriter, but it was a device of staggering complexity. With its series of rotating wheels and plug boards, it could scramble a simple message into a string of gibberish that was, in the Germans' view, mathematically unbreakable. They believed, with that same familiar arrogance, that no one on Earth could read their mail. They were wrong. The Allies, in a massive, top-secret effort headquartered at Bletchley Park in England, had done the impossible. Thanks to the early work of Polish mathematicians and the genius of men like Alan Turing, they had built machines that could, after agonizing effort, crack the Enigma codes. But cracking the code was only half the battle. You needed the keys, the daily settings for the Enigma machines. And those keys were often found in captured German materials. This brings us to one of the great untold stories of American heroism in the Atlantic. In June 1944, a U.S. Navy hunter-killer group, centered around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and commanded by a hard-charging captain named Daniel Gallery, had been hunting a U-boat for days. They finally cornered it, U-505. They battered it with depth charges, forcing it to the surface. The German crew, believing their sub was sinking, scrambled out and abandoned ship, but they had failed to properly scuttle it. Captain Gallery saw an opportunity that no one had ever dared to take. He ordered a boarding party to seize the U-boat. It was an incredibly dangerous move. The submarine was wallowing in the waves, rigged with demolition charges, and could sink at any moment. But a team of brave American sailors, led by Lieutenant Albert David, leapt from their small boat onto the deck of the enemy submarine. They stormed down the hatches, fighting their way through the sinking vessel, finding and disarming the scuttling charges with just minutes to spare. They captured the U-505 intact. And in its radio room, they found the Holy Grail, the Enigma machine, and even more importantly, the codebooks for the next several months. It was an intelligence windfall that simply cannot be overstated. Lieutenant David would later receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership in this incredible action. The U-505 itself, a steel tomb that should have been at the bottom of the ocean, was towed in secret to Bermuda. Today, it sits in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, a massive silent monument to the secret that truly won the war. Now, the Allies didn't just know where the U-boats were. They knew where Dönitz was telling them to go. They could read his mail. The Beartrap was no longer just a weapon, it was a global system. The Allies could now route their convoys around the waiting wolf packs. And even better, they could send their new hunter-killer groups, those fast, deadly teams of escort carriers and destroyers, directly to the U-boats' gathering points. The U-boats, arriving for what they thought was a surprise attack, would find a hornet's nest of planes and Hedgehog-equipped destroyers waiting for them. The hunters had become, finally and irrevocably, the hunted. The results were immediate and devastating. The spring of 1943 became known to the U-boat crews as Black May. In that 1 month, the Allies, using this new integrated system of air power, sonar, Hedgehog, and Enigma intelligence, sank 41 U-boats. It was a catastrophe from which the U-boat fleet would never recover. Karl Dönitz, in despair, wrote in his war diary, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He was forced to pull almost all of his U-boats out of the North Atlantic. The tonnage war was over. The Allies had won. Hitler, of course, refused to accept this. He was blinded by his own propaganda, trapped in his own fantasies. He ordered Dönitz to continue the fight, to send his men out to their certain deaths. And Dönitz, to his shame, obeyed. He continued to push for new wonder weapons like the Type 21 U-boat, an advanced submarine that could have changed the war if it had arrived 2 years earlier. But it was too little, too late. Hitler had underestimated everything about his enemy. He underestimated American will to fight. He underestimated our industrial capacity to build ships faster than he could dream of sinking them. And most of all, he underestimated the quiet, patient, relentless ingenuity of the men in the labs and the workshops.
He saw the Beartrap as a single, crude device. He couldn't see the system behind it. He couldn't see the long-range B-24s flying overhead, the streams of escort carriers built in American factories, the brilliant codebreakers in England reading his private mail, or the Hedgehog launchers waiting in the dark to deliver a sudden, silent death. The story of the U-boat war is a grim one. The U-boat service had the highest casualty rate of any military branch in any nation in the entire war. Of the 40,000 men who went to sea in German U-boats, over 30,000 never came home, a staggering 75% casualty rate. They were brave men, fighting for a monstrous cause, and they were sent to their graves by Hitler's arrogance and Dönitz's fanaticism. But their defeat was a victory that made all other victories possible. Without control of the Atlantic, there would have been no D-Day. There would have been no liberation of France, no final assault on Germany. The millions of American soldiers who crossed that ocean to fight for freedom did so on ships that were kept safe by this incredible, hard-won system of technology and intelligence. It was a long, brutal, and often forgotten fight, but it was a fight that had to be won. And it was won not just by steel and sacrifice, but by brains. It was won by the men who were smart enough to build a better trap. The story of the U-boat war is filled with these incredible acts of bravery and genius. If this history matters to you, the best way to support this channel and help us tell more stories like it is to share this video. Send it to a friend or post it in a community group that you think would appreciate this piece of our shared history. It's a powerful reminder that the most complex problems are often solved not by one magic bullet, but by a system of clever, dedicated people working together. Thank you for watching.